Now, Spike and Otis on when to cross the Bay Bridge.
Wake up, Otis!
Spike.
Time to leave. Don't be snoring.
It's 8 o'clock in the morning.
More beach and boardwalk. Woohoo!
Time for fries and good food, too.
Going home? Here's a gem.
Cross the bay after 10 p.m.
Tell him more, lady.
Avoid Bay Bridge backups with 24/7 traffic updates at 1-877-BASEBAN. That's 1-877-229-7726 or baybridge.com.
Get there happy.
Get home happier.
I'm Jonathan Braylock.
I'm Gerard Milligan.
And I'm James III. And we're the hosts of Black Men Can't Jump in Hollywood. It's a comedic podcast that reviews films with leading actors of color and analyzes them in the context of race and Hollywood's diversity issues.
Yeah.
Listen to new episodes on Mondays. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
I don't care where you get them. I just want you to listen.
Don't threaten the people. We need them to listen.
Oh, okay. Sorry, guys. Listen to us.
Hey. Yeah, put on a happy voice.
What more can I say? You know what it is.
Black men can't jump in Hollywood.
Hi, I'm Josh Levine, and this is Hang Up and Listen for the week of July 3rd, 2023. And this week, I'm not going to give you our usual lineup because this is not a usual show. We have got something special planned, a conversation about which sports have given the world the best art, the sports culture power rankings, if you please. So get ready to make your picks and to argue with us mentally. I am in Washington, D.C., and I'm the author of The Queen and the host of the podcast 1 Year. Also in D.C. is Stefan Fatsis. He is the author of the books, well, I think just some of the best art that anyone has created in all of sports. Word Freak, A Few Seconds of Panic, and Wild and Outside. Hello, Stefan.
So that's Scrabble, football, baseball.
In that order?
It could be that order.
Tune in to find out. We're going to tell all of you that it would be un-American this 4th of July week not to listen to all 4 episodes of Joel Anderson's Slow Burn Season 8 on prolific dunker Clarence Thomas. So please tune in for that. And now, joining us this week, our special guest, the co-creator of Parks and Rec and Brooklyn Nine-Nine, creator of The Good Place, executive producer of everything else on television. He's also the co-host of the Pozcast with Joe Posnanski, where last week they conducted an amazing sports facts draft. He's also a man who finagled his way into being a regular on the Dan Le Batard Show with Stugotz by writing about it for Slate. I should try that sometime. It is TV's own Mike Schur. Mike, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, gentlemen. How are you? Everybody good?
I think everybody is good. I hope we don't tear each other to bits. We'll find out.
Drafts can do that, Drafts can get really contentious. I'm warning you. Posnanski and I have a lot of knockdown dragouts during our drafts on our podcast. So
one of the most violent men in America, Joe Posnanski.
A deeply cruel and violent man, yes.
All right. As I teased at the top of the show, we are going to talk about which sports have given the world the best art. We should probably define our terms here. Mike, we gave you the topic in advance because we're not as cruel as Joe Posnanski is. As you've been thinking about this, kind of how have you defined this question in your mind?
Well, there's obvious things, right? There's books, movies, TV shows, popular culture, forays, that sort of thing. I've also added in journalism or sort of reporting, I guess, because I think that in bygone eras, that was a mass medium in a way. Maybe it isn't quite now, but it's still, when you go through the annals, when you delve into which sports mattered the most to the country and how they mattered, it felt like the reporting on those sports and the essays written about those sports and the cultural moments, things that mattered and things that sort of reverberated through the culture includes journalism to me. So those are my main factors, I would say, is the what you think of as the classic artistic media, and then also it's not quite art, but it is art adjacent, is the way that those sports were reported on and written about in the press. That's what I did. I don't know how you guys defined it.
I mean, I would add one thing to that because I think those are obviously excellent categories and adding journalism makes a lot of sense. The one thing that I sort of focused on in addition was how have sports contributed to the broader culture, whether it's through language or personalities or just sort of general awareness. And I think that's a good way of trying to sort of encapsulate the influence of particular sports on American or North American culture, especially.
And I would also say that there's bonus points for me when a sport or a thing from that sport shows up in a non-sports context. We're not going to be debating here whether, like, is Die Hard a Christmas movie? Is Along Came Polly a basketball movie? I don't know why that one just popped into my head. But it is telling to me when there is, for instance, a great whatever scene where you don't expect it. And so for me, that gives some bonus points. All right.
That does
Mike,
bump Scrabble up a little bit, Josh, I have to say. A lot of good Scrabble scenes in movies.
Not that you're biased.
No.
Always looking for that 10-point bonus. All right. So, Mike, I think you're the kind of dumb draft expert here. And for that reason, and since you're the road team, we're going to give you the first pick.
Well, no surprise, I'm picking baseball. It's interesting, right? Because baseball as a cultural phenomenon has certainly been on the wane for a very long time now. I think you could reasonably say that the last time that baseball captured the nation's imagination truly was the Sosa McGuire home run chase in the late 90s. You could potentially, if you were me and you were biased, say that it was actually the 2003-2004 Red Sox-Yankees two-season drama. But I'm not sure that captured the nation's attention in the way that the McGuire-Sosa thing did. But if you go back and look at the whole history, part of this is just that it's the oldest sport we have. Part of it is that it's more lyric and sort of elegiac than most sports are. You get the best movies by far, I would say, of any sport. There's the Field of Dreams and The Natural. And, you know, Bull Durham and Alibi Ike, if you go back 100 years.
We want you to lose your next two games. There's a lot of money in it for you. How about it? Not a chance. Come on, get back there.
There's also a bunch of kids' movies that really matter that are baseball movies. There are great novels written about baseball, The Natural being an obvious one. All of David Halberstam's writing that's about baseball was important. Robert Coover wrote the Universal Baseball Association, which is one of my personal favorites. And then there's also this sort of halo, and this goes to, I think, a little bit of what Stefan was saying, was like, you know, when someone does something good, we still say that person hit a home run. We don't say that person scored a touchdown, usually. Baseball terminology is much more pervasive in the culture than any other sport. And then when you go to what I'm talking about or mentioned before, which is the sort of like journalistic aspect of it, I think it was Dan Jenkins who said that the smaller the ball, the better the writing is about the sport.
I think it was George Plimpton, actually, wasn't it?
Was it George Plimpton? Maybe, yeah. So
marbles, then golf, then baseball.
That's right. The Large Hadron Collider has the best writing by far. But like, you know, the Updike essay about Ted Williams' last at bat, Hub fans bid kid adieu, is still a sort of classic of the genre. The way that the reporters from the time captured Bobby Thompson's Shot Heard Around the World, and there was a sense that baseball was not just called the national pastime, but really was the national pastime. It was a thing that captivated people and permeated the culture in a way that I don't think other sports, even with like football's dominance in the culture now, or the excitement of basketball, or you know, the international success of soccer, like those things haven't quite ever mattered as much to a culture as baseball has mattered to America. Now, if we do this draft again 30 years from now, this might be a very different answer, because I think, again, you could argue that in the last 3 decades, there's been less and less of that, of baseball leaking into the culture. There's been there's been sort of a more egalitarian, influence from a bunch of different sports. But as of right now, I would argue that baseball has mattered the most to American culture of any sport.
I think the point that you made about the answer being different in 30 years is one that I thought about a lot as I was making my own list. And, when I was growing up, I was just completely, utterly obsessed with baseball in a way that kids of many generations in this country have been. Baseball cards, reading the baseball encyclopedia, et cetera, and so forth. But also kind of in the way that I was alluding to a few minutes ago, when I watched the movies that I was kind of obsessed with as a kid, like Ferris Bueller's Day Off and The Naked Gun, baseball is an important part of those movies. Like, I would argue that I was discussing this with some friends the other night, like the baseball scene in The Naked Gun might be the greatest baseball scene in the history of American cinema.
Let's see if that uniform's on straight. Put it back here. Let's see, the shirt. Well, you should take a large and little tight in the crotch.
In Ferris Bueller's Day Off, like, they go to a baseball game in Wrigley Field. And I just think that a kid that not only grows up today, but that grew up maybe like a generation after me, they're not going to be exposed to baseball in the same way that I was. And it's just like kind of an incidental thing in culture where kids in the movie go to a baseball game, or, when you're looking for like a set piece in a classic comedy, that it's going to take place at a baseball game. So, Stefan, I don't know how you weigh that versus, as Mike laid out, the incredibly long and rich and also varied history of, baseball in the culture.
All I can think about right now is whether set piece is derived from soccer language or whether it came first. The history, obviously, is the overwhelming factor here. Baseball being America's game and America's first game meant that it had this gigantic head start. I mean, James Naismith didn't invent basketball until the 20th century. That's a lot of time in between. Back to my little idioms observation, there's an entire wiki for baseball idioms or language idioms derived from baseball. And it's about twice as many as the second most in a sport. And what would that second sport be, do you think? Where's number 2 on the idioms list?
God, I have no idea.
It's boxing.
Right.
It's boxing. And that makes sense because language evolves over time and the contributions to language are going to be based on what sports, in this case, are important at any given time. I mean, baseball's even got its own wiki for metaphors for sex. The pervasiveness of the sport on how we think every day and not just think about sports is huge. It's overwhelming. I sort of counted on the general sports idioms list on Wiki, and after boxing, it was American football, and then it quickly plunges to horse racing down to the wire, home stretch, under the wire, ringer, win by a nose, but nothing compares to baseball. The way that baseball has stuck its nose into every aspect of American society is almost entirely attributable to its longevity. But that doesn't mean that it necessarily had to produce great art. And there's something inherent or intrinsic in the sport that led to the production of the great art. It is, Josh, like you say, the fact that we all grew up with this just being in the fabric of our being. For me, it was any number of 70s and early 80s pieces of culture. Ball 4 was my favorite book. It was the book I read over and over again, starting when I was 13 years old. The Bad News Bears, one of my favorite movies of all time because it came out when I was 11.
Hey, Engelbert.
What?
There's chocolate all over this ball.
Look, Mr. Buttermaker, quit bugging me about my food. People are always bugging me about it. My shrink says that's why I'm so fat. So you're not doing me any good, so let's quit it.
Okay.
And the list, of course, of baseball adjacent or baseball specific movies, films, TV is way longer than anything else, books too.
To your point, Josh, I was thinking when Queen Elizabeth died, Reggie Jackson tweeted something. I don't know if you saw it. He said I had nothing to do with it or something.
Yeah.
And if you're me and you're 47 years old, that was like an incredible moment. That was like a really wonderful moment. And if you're 29, you're thinking, what the hell is going on here? Why is Reggie Jackson tweeting about the Queen dying and him have nothing to do with it? So I think we are, I think we're at the very edge of the moment where the answer to this, what sport has influenced the culture the most is baseball. I think I don't know what's going to replace it. Maybe a patchwork of other sports will replace it en masse. But I think right now, because we're still in the era where folks in their, call it middle age, have Ferris Bueller and The Naked Gun and Rookie of the Year and The Sandlot and Angels in the Outfield and all of those things from our youth, I think we still feel the presence of baseball in the culture in a way that maybe my son, who's 15, does not.
One more comment from me, and then I've got a question about an individual question for each of you guys. But I would say, A League of Their Own is the obvious exception here. But I think one of the arguments against baseball is that it's a sport that traditionally, in large part, women have not played in this country or any other country. And for its first 100 years, excluded Black people.
Yep.
That's Major League Baseball. I mean,
Sure.
Black people played baseball, and, there's Bingo Long Traveling All-Stars and Motor Kings.
Sure.
There's, a bunch of art about the Negro Leagues and the history of baseball
Absolutely.
in Black America. But I don't know if it covers the entire kind of richness of the human experience in a way that maybe some of the other sports we talk about do. But yeah, my question for you, Stefan, is your first book was a baseball book. And I'm wondering, is it because you wanted to write about baseball specifically, because you were kind of drawing on that long history that we talked about, or your first book could have been about football or could have been about something else?
I think it could have been, but the other part of baseball that is embedded in sports culture and then American culture more broadly is its importance as a business and legal phenomenon. Baseball, the first free agency efforts that we identify with sports were baseball. And Curt Flood is obviously an enormously influential person in the history of American jurisprudence. And for me, I wrote that book about an independent minor league in the Midwest, the Northern League, because I had done a bunch of stories about the business of baseball as the sport was leading up to a strike in the 1990s. But I don't know that I would have been as interested if it wasn't because of what my childhood was and what my likes were. Sure, professionally, I could have written about anything, but I wanted to write a book about baseball. I was 30. That's what I was interested in doing. It's the sport that I grew up with and loved.
And Mike, you attempted to make a television series of Field of Dreams. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that process, what drew you to it, and what happened there.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, the studio I work for, Universal, or worked for until the Writers Guild went on strike on May 2nd, and I'm temporarily not working for, they approached me about doing an updated version of Field of Dreams, and it took a long time for me to say yes, because I revere the movie, and, doing a reboot or whatever you want to call it about something that you revere is very scary. And so I wasn't sure I was going to try it, and then eventually figured out a sort of angle on it that I liked. So I said yes, and then it was in development for 2 years, and we wrote all the scripts, and we scouted in Iowa and built a baseball field in a cornfield that's still sitting there as we speak. It's got lights and everything. It's very beautiful. And then basically enough time had gone by that Peacock, which was going to air it, they sort of just changed their minds and decided that they didn't want to do it anymore. And the reasons for that are many, but it has a lot to do with the sort of shifting economics of the streaming business, and some of it, but not all of it, is like the reason we're on strike right now. So it was sad because I had gotten to a place where I really liked what I had done and what the team of writers had done, and was very excited to sort of try to tackle that subject. So the ending is sad, but the process of making it was wonderful, of writing it, because the source material is extremely rich and interesting and sort of human. And I really sort of delved into that movie and tried to break it down to its molecular level to figure out what it was that was so moving about it and which has affected so many people and changed so many people's lives. And it's a perfect mix of like baseball adds to that movie exactly what is needed, which is this sort of like contemplative, sort of methodical investigation of the rhythms and the flowings of generations and parents and kids. And the speech that James Earl Jones gives about how the one constant has been baseball, which isn't really true, but we'll overlook that for now. But that speech, the sort of speechifying that goes on in that movie, where you're talking both about sort of generational things that we hand down, things that we inherit from our parents and from their parents and from their parents, that is a thing that baseball has over every other sport. And it's not like people are Steelers fans because their dads were Steelers fans. That's certainly true in other sports. But baseball, because it is so old and because it's so poetic and elegiac, it has an advantage. When you're talking about art, it has an advantage over the other sports because I just think it's more lyrical and more sort of emotional than other sports. The length of it, the season, the rhythm of the game, the kind of the contemplative nature of the actual gameplay. I think it just sort of all comes together in a way that is more suggestive of great art than maybe some of the other sports are, which are more violent or sort of flashy.
And you think that, I mean, obviously you do. You think it would have worked and captured an audience now in the same way that it did in the 1980s, despite what we've been talking about, the game not meaning as much to your 15-year-old as it did to you.
Is the corollary question there is, how did you adapt it to recognize the realities of where baseball sits in American culture right now?
It's a good question. They're both good questions. I certainly hoped it would capture people's imaginations in the way the original did. My feeling was that I had to break down and get to the essence of and the core of what it was that affected people. And so I made a list of like, I held myself to 6 topics. It was, what are the 6 things that Field of Dreams really is? And that list was like, in the original movie, fathers and sons, baseball, Iowa. I can't remember even what they were, but it was like the 6 things that were like the very core of it.
Death.
And then
choking on a hot dog.
Choking on a hot dog, sure. And I threw away everything else, or at least put everything else on the chopping block. And so in the updated version, I retold the story of the original movie, but I made the daughter older. The daughter was 15 or 16. And I don't want to get into the entire story, but basically it was Ray and his daughter were the central relationship. It was still his father who had died and whose ghost he was sort of chasing. But I sort of retold that large chunks of that story. And simultaneously, I was telling a story of that daughter, now grown in modern day. And Ray dies, and she goes through a similar kind of journey reconnecting with Ray as Ray had with his father. So first of all, it made women what they weren't in the original, which was part of the story. In fact, the center of the story. And then there were other things, like I changed Moonlight Graham from a guy who had gotten into one inning of one game and never gotten to hit into a Negro Leagues player. So the reason that Moonlight Graham hadn't been able to play wasn't because he just never got his shot. It was because he never got his shot, because he couldn't have his shot because he was black. So there was a whole episode that took place back in 1945, just as that Jackie was about to break in and the Negro Leagues were just barely ending. And Moonlight Graham in my story was a 38, 39-year-old guy, sort of almost a Satchel Paige-like figure it didn't even matter if the league integrated, because he was at the end of his career and he was not going to be young enough to sort of make the majors. So, I attempted to take what was great about the movie and then also add in, with the advantage of having 7 hours to tell the story instead of an hour 45, I attempted to add in a bunch of stuff that I felt was missing from the movie, not because the people who made the movie were negligent, but simply because you can't tell all of those sorts of stories in one hour and 45-minute long movie. So it was my attempt to sort of take what is so wonderful about that film and just make it more thick and sort of fill it out and tell more stories about baseball, the history of baseball in America, that sort of thing. And, you know, I like I said, I really thought the writers that we assembled on the team of folks in the writers' room did a really great job. I think we broke really interesting stories. I think it would have been really good. It's just we sort of ran up against a immovable force, which is that the economics of how TV is made have radically changed in the last 2 years.
I am sorry I will not be able to watch that. Thanks for nothing, Peacock.
Reboot your credit card with Apple Card, the credit card created by Apple. It gives you unlimited daily cash back that you can automatically deposit at 4.15% annual percentage yield when you open a high-yield savings account. And savings is built right into the Wallet app, so it's easy to monitor your progress. Apply for Apple Card now in the Wallet app on iPhone and start growing your daily cash with savings today. Apple Card subject to credit approval. Savings is available to Apple Card owners, subject to eligibility requirements. Savings accounts provided by Goldman Sachs Bank USA. Member FDIC. Terms apply.
I'm Jonathan Braylock.
I'm Gerard Milligan.
And I'm James III. And we're the hosts of Black Men Can't Jump in Hollywood. It's a comedic podcast that reviews films with leading actors of color and analyzes them in the context of race and Hollywood's diversity issues.
Yeah. Listen to new episodes on Mondays. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
I don't care where you get them. I just want you to listen.
Don't threaten the people. We need them to listen.
Oh, okay. Sorry, guys. Listen to us.
Yay. Yeah, put on a happy voice.
What more can I say? You know what it is.
Black men can't jump.
Stefan, do you want to make our next pick?
Sure. It's come down to basketball or football for me for number 2. And I think that the accumulation of great media and culturally important work about basketball kicks it up for me. And I'm thinking now of some of the best sports movies of all time. Hoop Dreams, Hoosiers, White Men Can't Jump. One of the best TV shows about sports of all time, I think, is The White Shadow. And some of my favorite books about sports are about basketball. Heaven is a Playground, The Last Shot, In These Girls' Hope is a Muscle, Loose Balls by Terry Pluto about the ABA, A Sense of Where You Are about Bill Bradley. I guess you have to throw in A Season on the Brink, whether you like John Feinstein or not. So I think just the sort of, like, it's got a lot of A-plus material, and you combine that with the cultural influence of the sport over the last 40 years and its rapid rise to overtake baseball as a fan phenomenon, I think really catapult basketball into that upper tier.
Yeah, I find that convincing. Maybe as we go around, there's some other stuff that I would include there as well. But a thing that we haven't really talked about is the kind of like online culture or culture of like, sort of like, whether it's trick shot videos or dunk videos, there's just like a lot of creativity around the way that people consume and produce content around basketball. And there's just a kind of vibrancy there that is certainly missing with baseball. And you're just certainly more likely to, encounter, references to basketball in, songs and hip hop. There's more likely to be a good movie about basketball, whether it's Hustle or, if you go back a little bit, like Love and Basketball, there's like interesting stuff kind of happening around the sport. It energizes and excites like kind of whether it's new directors or writers in a way that I think other sports don't. And so it's certainly on the upswing, Mike. And I don't know if like this is when you imagine the kind of lines crossing, if it was basketball that you were thinking about.
Yeah, I think basketball might be the answer to what is the dominant force very soon. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think certainly the rise of Black culture in the country. Like Jay-Z can say Jordan Game 6 and everybody knows what he's talking about.
Psycho, I'm liable to go Michael. Take your pick, Jackson, Tyson, Jordan, Game 6. Also got a broke clock.
And Jack Harlow wrote an entire song about Tyler Hero, who's not a particularly interesting basketball player.
Boy Tyler, he playing South Beach. He told me this summer he gonna fix my jumper. I told Boy Wonder that we might got a thumper. I've been trying to pop, now I'm on like Shumper.
And that goes back like 30 years now, Mike. I mean, I'm thinking of Curtis Blow in basketball.
I like slam dunks, taking it to the hoop. My favorite play is the alley oop. I like the pick and roll. I like the give and go. Cause it's basketball of Mr. Curtis Blow.
40 years. Sorry, 40 years.
Yeah.
Starks got ejected, etc.
Yeah. I mean, the Beastie Boys are rapping about John Starks like 30 years ago. So that's part of it. The other interesting thing I think about basketball is by far the best documentaries. And that's something that it's interesting that baseball doesn't really have in the same way. Football doesn't even really have. Football has, has a TV show about, about the preseason that people get excited about to some extent. But Hoop Dreams, like The Last Dance, that's what everyone watched in the pandemic was The Last Dance. Like there are cultural phenomena like Michael Jordan and LeBron James who certainly transcend sports and are primarily almost cultural figures before they are sports figures at this point. I worked on a show called Primo that's out now on Freevee with Shea Serrano, who was a basketball writer for The Ringer and other places. He wrote a book called Basketball and Other Things, which was like on President Obama's, best of the year list. And it's very much a pastiche, a mashup of cultural stuff and basketball and how basketball affects the culture and everything else. That documentary, Magic and Bird, A Courtship of Rivals, that came out a long time ago was fascinating. And then you also have March Madness. And even though the best basketball players like Victor Wembanyama did not go to an American university and was never in March Madness, it almost doesn't matter. Like, people still get so excited for that tournament. They fill out brackets in every office and every business in America. And for a couple weeks, the world is captivated by Florida Atlantic making a run or whatever it is. Even if they don't know any of the players, I couldn't name a single player on any of those teams. There's no other sport that I think captures people's attention like that, where like the personalities are secondary to the phenomenon of the actual gameplay. So, and I would also add, by the way, in terms of the journalism, the book When Nothing Else Matters about Jordan coming back to make his comeback with the Wizards, like, not that it had this enormous effect on the culture, but simply that Michael Jordan alone has been worth 25 really great works of art in a bunch of different media, right? Documentaries and journalism and reporting and books and just cultural references and stuff. Like, I think basketball is very much ascendant in this regard, and I think that it will ultimately, at some point in the near future, pass baseball in terms of its entire history and how much it matters to America.
Yeah, Josh, I think of all of our mutual friend John Hawkes' canon of work, and I think basketball accounts for the most documentaries that he has made. Hawk actually emailed about this and mentioned the Plimpton essay right before we taped. We had been talking about it. So I won't tell you what John put first on his list, but then he wrote, recently, basketball is predominant, honorable mention for football, which created the template for contemporary sports storytelling in the visual media. Plimpton's small ball theory is a thing of the past, I'm afraid, John said, in which the smaller the ball, the better the book. John then cited, and remembered this, that Plimpton mentioned Mark Twain's celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County in that essay. The essay was in the New York Times Magazine in 1992. In Plimpton's words, he called that Twain story the most universally known of sports stories, in which birdshot, very small balls indeed, is an important element in the plot.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and I think of like John's documentary Off the Res about Shoni Schimmel being, just one of many films that he's made. But it's kind of an example of how I think there's really an entry point for everyone in the sport. If you're a kid, there's, Space Jam. I mentioned Love and Basketball before. If you like rom-coms, like there's that for you. It feels like so much more, like exponentially more inclusive than baseball. And I also wonder, Mike, if the existence of Winning Time, the HBO show about the Lakers, and also The Last Dance shows, given the kind of ascendancy of basketball and culture, there is now going to be the opportunity to tell great stories from even the recent past and basketball, sort of like we have in baseball. There's just kind of endless media and art about the great moments through all of baseball history. I wonder if we're now going to be in a golden age of revisiting golden ages about basketball.
I think that's entirely possible, certainly. I think that the sport is now old enough and has enough history that people are genuinely interested in to begin to warrant that the sort of revisiting of old stories. It's also more than worth saying at this point that I watched the College World Series last night. LSU won, and they romped over Florida's 18-4 in Game 3 or something. And Dylan Cruz, who's going to be the number one pick in the draft this year, it is like the best, probably all around hitting prospect since Mike Trout. He tripled in one inning, and they were up 12 runs or whatever. And he pointed to his ring finger, and he did that because Angel Reese did that when LSU was going to win the women's Final Four. She started doing that. And then all of the women on the LSU team started doing that after every shot. And it was like that when a sport is powerful enough and that in the women's Final Four, the things that happen on the court are the main topic of discussion for the country for a while. Angel Reese was the number one discussion topic in the country for a good week during that run. And not only has she continued to be a person of interest in sports at large, now the men's baseball team months later is imitating her gesture as they round second and head to third or whatever. That gives you some indication of that there's a gender equality thing that doesn't exist in baseball. It doesn't exist in football. It is getting there in soccer and might someday, the Women's World Cup is happening very soon. If the U.S. women make another run and win another World Cup, maybe that will bump them up even further. And there's a lot of, the gender pay equality stuff that's happened in that sport has been very prominent in the national discussion. But it's pretty amazing that a gesture made by a women's college basketball player is now like, that's the hot thing to do in a different sport, in a different men's sport. Like, I think that's a thing that basketball has over essentially every other sport except soccer at this point, that there is a burgeoning excitement in the women's side of things that didn't exist 10, 15, 20 years ago. Even when UConn was dominant, when they were winning all their championships, that was cool and interesting and people were sort of tuning in, but it wasn't rippling out in the way that Angel Reese rippled out after that Final Four run. So I think basketball is getting old enough and it's getting sort of broad enough in its scope that we're now about to see it really take over.
A beautiful soliloquy about the greatness of LSU sports, although I would point out that Joe Burrow did it before Angel Reese did.
Oh, did he really?
But Angel Reese popularized it in a way that the, only slightly popular American sport of football could never dream of doing.
That's kind of amazing that I don't have any memory of Joe Burrow doing it, but I sure have a memory of Angel Reese doing it.
Hey everybody, it's Tim Heidecker. You know me, Tim and Eric, Bridesmaids, and Fantastic Four. I'd like to personally invite you to listen to Office Hours Live with me and my co-hosts, DJ Doug Pound.
Hello.
And Vic Berger.
Howdy.
Every week we bring you laughs, fun, games, and lots of other surprises. It's live. We take your Zoom calls.
Music.
We love having fun. Excuse me?
Songs. Vic said something.
Songs.
Music.
I like having fun. I like to laugh. I like to meet people who can make me laugh. Please subscribe now.
There's a reckoning happening in women's soccer in the U.S.
Tonight, the world of professional women's soccer is turned upside down.
It began with a few brave players who decided to speak out. Their decision forever changed the game. This is their story.
This is about safety in our own lives and our bodies.
The whole system is screwed up.
From Religion of Sports and PRX, I'm Brian Ascuri, and this is Counterattack.
Women's sports are powerful. They deserve respect. They are the future.
Listen now on Amazon Music.
All right. This is perhaps a transition into football. And Stefan, I think maybe what John Hawk was alluding to, what exactly did he say about football kind of defining the visuals of the world that we live in? What exactly was that?
Created the template for contemporary sports storytelling in the visual media.
I think that's a really strong argument, and I think he's referring to NFL films there
Where
largely, but also the way that kind of football is broadcast and televised, I think has had a profound impact on the culture, has changed like so much about the way we consume so many different things on television. And I think somewhat of an oversight, maybe because of the generation that we're in or just because of our interests, is that we haven't referred to video games at all. And I think that the gaming culture around, baseball and basketball is certainly strong and pervasive. But what Madden has done and how that has affected the culture is extraordinary.
As FIFA has with soccer too, Josh.
Certainly. And I think in football, I guess I wouldn't argue with its placement in these rankings. And I feel like maybe football has underachieved, like in a way that you wouldn't necessarily imagine given its prominence in our culture today, as well as historically. I can certainly run off a long list of things here. A Few Seconds of Panic, obviously, would be number one, and Paper Lion, like a lot of great experiential journalism in football. There's The Longest Yard. There's Semi-Tough by Dan Jenkins, maybe one of the funniest books ever written. There's Friday Night Lights, which is its whole kind of literary and cinematic universe that was maybe, and I'm curious for your thoughts on this, Mike, kind of the most effective and long-running sports show that I can think of, that kind of figured out in a way how to do sports in a way that felt kind of realistic, but also inviting, that it wasn't just for sports fans, and was a pretty amazing kind of encapsulation of what football means to people. And, there's also the kind of social commentary of North Dallas 40. There's A Fan's Notes, which is one of my favorite books. So it's not like there's any kind of lack of great material. And I do think it's really expansive, but I'm not sure that even when you add all of that stuff up, that it kind of stacks up with the two sports we've talked about already.
Yeah, I would also throw like The Blind Side in there as a sort of a crossover story that's centered on football.
Remember the Titans, certainly, too.
Remember the Titans, We Are Marshall, things like that. That there are some wonderful stories. I mean, Friday Night Lights, to answer your first point, Friday Night Lights is, I think, unique in all of the things we've mentioned because it was a great book that mattered a lot to a lot of people, that became a great movie that mattered a lot to a lot of people, and then became a great TV show that mattered a lot to a lot of people. I don't know that there's very many books about sports that have run the gamut in the way that Friday Night Lights did. Yeah.
Almost Field of Dreams.
Yeah, exactly. Except that the book Shoeless Joe is really weird. I can't quite recommend the book.
Did you know, Mike, that W.P. Kinsella was a Scrabble player?
I did not know that.
For crossover.
Interesting. So I agree, though, that I think I agree that the dominance of football in the sports world would suggest that it would be more dominant in the culture at large than it is. And I don't know how to explain that. I remember Friday Night Lights came out, the show, and the reviews were glowing. It was like, man, is this thing good? Like, what a great cast of people. What an incredible story. Everybody loved Connie Britton. Everybody loved Kyle Chandler. Everybody loved all the kids. You know, there was an enormous cast. The setting was very authentic and real. It felt like they were real people in a lived-in world.
Every man at some point in his life is going to lose a battle. He's going to fight and he's going to lose. But what makes him a man is that in the midst of that battle, he does not lose himself. This game is not over. This battle is not over. So let's hear it one more time. Together. Clear eyes, full hearts.
Let's go!
And the ratings weren't that good. Like, it just, people didn't really en masse rush to watch it. And I'm sure that NBC at the time was like, what do we have to do? This is the most popular sport by far in America. This is a piece of IP that people know. And it's an incredibly well-made show. It's brilliantly written and incredibly acted and well-wrought in every possible way. And yet it wasn't a gigantic hit in the way that you may have maybe thought it would have been. I don't know how to explain that except to say that there's an adage in TV that if you make any show about any subject that's divisive, not that football is more, by divisive, all I mean is some people like it and some people don't, right? And so I think what happens is people, you know, they hear, oh, it's a show about football. If they don't like football, they're not going to watch it. There's a sort of barrier of entry to any show that's about a sport if you don't like that sport. And it doesn't matter how many people tell you it's not really about football. In your mind, it's still a show about football and I don't care about football. So you're sort of limiting your potential audience as opposed to a show about a family or that takes place in an office or something, right? I don't know if that's what happened there or what, but it speaks to in some way, even if it's only metaphorical, this weird fact about football, which is the absolute unquestioned alpha of sports in America right now that isn't quite as pervasive in the culture as even basketball is or some other sports. It's just an odd fact, and I don't have any explanation for it.
I will say that it is a weird comparison to make or a weird conclusion to draw, given how overwhelmingly popular this sport is. It dwarfs people's interest. It dwarfs every other sport in terms of popular interest. TV ratings, especially. Amount of coverage, overwhelming. And the quality of the popular culture generated by the sport, and I think this is what John was driving at, you know, since the 1960s and since NFL films, football created a template for a sort of dramatic violence that can be filled with pathos and good storytelling. You know, and I said earlier that basketball movies at the very peak and basketball books at the peak are among the highest quality. It's not like football hasn't given us those kinds of stories. Football is very much conducive to dramatic, very American hero stories, whether that's Any Given Sunday, Remember the Titans. I mean, you could put Rudy in that category, whether you hate the movie or not. You could put Brian's Song in that category, which is a really dated piece of filmmaking from the early 1970s. But the way that football can draw that sort of, that human, physical emotion out of art, I think is something real and, you know, and really commends it. I mean, we talked about TV shows about football and how Friday Night Lights was the outlier. I mean, the real outlier was Playmakers, which was a great show about the realities of professional football that ran on ESPN and effectively got shut down by the network because they felt it was hitting too close to home in the early 2000s.
So this is a theory that I don't know is true, but it is a theory. Playmakers was like, let's get into the gritty reality of what it means to be a football player. the movie Concussion, starring the unquestioned biggest movie star in the world at the time, was a flop. I think there is something potentially about football because it's so violent, because people's lives have been ruined by it, because of CTE and because of injury and because of the inherent sadness of a disposable human body being thrown into a pile of other disposable bodies, and people just washing out of the league and not being able to walk properly when they're in their 40s, and suicides and heart attacks and all that, and steroids and all that sort of stuff. I think it's possible that one of the hesitations people have about engaging with the game outside of the game itself is they don't really want to confront a lot of that stuff. It might be subliminal or deeply psychological and not expressed even, but I do think that has an effect on people's appetite for the halo of stories around the actual sport. It's almost like they're making a bargain. They're making an agreement to watch the sport because it's so entertaining, but to block out the reality of what the sport means for the people who play it. And so when you get into a story, any kind of story outside the sport that has anything to do with the ramifications of the game, they might just be shying away from it a little bit. Like I mean, Concussion looked to me when I saw the trailer, I was like, well, this is going to win Will Smith's going to win an Oscar, and, this movie's going to be nominated for a million things. And people just kind of rejected it. And I think it was called Concussion. Like, I don't think people wanted to see a movie that reminded them that the people who play the game that they love so much are getting concussions all the time and are ruining their lives. It's just a theory, but I do think that might have some effect on the somewhat lower ceiling for cultural permeation that football seems to have than it should.
I think my football book was great. I'm very partial to it. I love my football book. It didn't sell for shit, Mike. It did not do well. And I've never really understood why it didn't do better. Maybe it was me. Maybe I promoted it badly. Maybe the publisher didn't do a good job. But there may be some truth in do I really want to know what's going on inside the NFL? Maybe not.
Yeah. I think that might be it.
Well, I mean, the concussion thing, it would have been a better test of the theory if it had actually been a good movie, in my opinion. But I mean, there are like Booby Miles from Friday Night Lights, Marcus Dupree from John's documentary, The Best There Never Was. And then if you want to talk about the journalism aspect, I mean, just absolutely gutting stories about men like Junior Seau and so forth. The pathos is there in art, journalism, documentary, if you want to find it. And so, it sort of depends on how we want to define our terms. We've talked more about audience receptiveness and interest in this conversation than we did in, say, the baseball or basketball one. I think there are a lot of, whether it's directors or writers who've provided a lot of material for those of us who are interested in consuming it that is incredibly rich. But I do think, the popularity of Madden and of fantasy football as just enormous mass culture phenomenons, the thing that both of those have in common is that they are ways to make the game less real, like to turn it into more of a cartoon than really digging into the way that it affects the people that play it. And so I think there is something to your theory, Mike.
When I worked at SNL, I played Madden with some people in the office. It was like 2003, and my players kept getting injured, and I was really annoyed by it. And then I went into the settings, and it was like, turn injuries off. And I was like, oh, great. And I turned injuries off. And I there is some wish fulfillment there, right? That you could this would be more fun if we could just click a button that turned the injuries off. But
in terms of, I want to make one little thing that I found in Googling before we were going to talk about this. I would not have guessed that football's penetration into the culture was as, I mean, I know it was in the late 1800s and early 1900s after the game was started, but was invented or adapted. But did you know classical music, Charles Ives composed a piece about the Yale-Princeton football game in 1898.
So he was the Hank Williams Jr. of his day, is what you're saying.
He was the Hank Williams Jr. of his day. It is called Yale-Princeton football game.
All right, we're approaching the hour mark here. And Mike, when we were talking before we had recorded, you're like, I'm not sure how many rounds we're going to get into here. So maybe we can do a lightning round. If you had to have a fourth pick, what would it be?
My fourth pick isn't about what now, it's about the future, and it would be soccer. I think that Ted Lasso as a cultural phenomenon is a harbinger of things to come in terms of where the culture is going. I think you've heard for decades, like, soccer's on the rise in the US, and I'm not sure that's actually been true, really. But I think it's true now. And I think that if you look at the next decade, the World Cup is coming here to Canada and Mexico. The Women's World Cup is happening this year, and the U.S. women are supposed to do pretty well, although they've had some injuries. I think Ted Lasso was a little bit of a breakthrough moment. The Peacock, I know for a fact, has been very pleased with the viewership for the Premier League broadcasts, the Champions League and the Euros that are coming up. And I just get this sense that America is going to be talking more about soccer by an order of magnitude in the next decade than we have in the previous decade.
So does that mean, Mike, that there are going to just be more pitches in Hollywood for TV shows or movies? I mean, we've been like Beckham is 15 years old now, right? It's not like this is a new phenomenon, but
it's a risky bet I'm making because it's possible that Ted Lasso will end and then nothing about soccer will ever appear on television ever again. But I do think that there is a pretty good chance that there is more popular culture outreach and more tendrils of soccer moving through the society over the next decade than a lot of other sports. So this is more of it's a pre-bet. It's not an actual observation about the culture now. It's a bet on what the culture will become over the next 10 years.
All right, and I'm going to go with a sort of a eulogy for a sport that will never have the kind of literary or cultural prominence that it did. And this was John Hawk's number one pick, which was boxing. Boxing has produced terrific movies, works of art, even music, Hurricane by Bob Dylan. And you think of Rocky and $1 Million Baby and Raging Bull and When We Were Kings. I mean, like Michael Jordan, Mike, Muhammad Ali is a journalistic and literary industry all to himself. When Sports Illustrated did its list of top 100 sports books of all time in 2002, the number one book on the list was The Sweet Science by A.J. Liebling. If you redid that list now, I don't know that Liebling would make it if the list was put together by somebody under, say, 60?
Yeah.
I don't know, Stefan. I was thinking about boxing, and I feel like it has the long and rich history that you just described, addition to all of that, just classic magazine stories by Mark Cram and a million other people. But I sort of feel like its popularity as a artistic or cultural product is sort of independent from its popularity of the sport. And I think maybe unkillable. We've seen how, Rocky, which was so kind of important and popular in the 70s and then up into the 80s as well, has been revived as Creed. The movies Girl Fight and $1 Million Baby, I think, are both excellent and influential. And I think it's interesting because you would think that the violence of football would maybe even push it ahead of basketball and baseball, just in terms of the richness of the subject matter, because we just love reading and watching people just beat the shit out of each other. But I think no matter in what form it is, there will always be something just absolutely captivating and like metaphorically rich about people in a ring just like hitting each other. I mean, I think also of like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. If nobody watches boxing in 20 years, people will still be writing about boxing, thinking about boxing, making art about boxing. It's like people hitting each other. I mean, there's nothing more human than that.
When I saw him go down, felt like somebody lied. I had to hold my breath till the coast was clear. When I saw him go down, felt like somebody lied. I had to close my eyes just to stop the tears. Pretty good song by the Killers.
Like there's a sort of like George Foreman grill part of this too, right? that there's like there are personalities like Ali, Foreman, Mike Tyson. These are people who, even if you've never watched a single boxing match in your life, which I have to say I don't think I have because I don't like it, I still know who all these people are. I understand the place that they held in the culture. Like Mike Tyson would be like a guest star on, Growing Pains or something when we were kids. And it was like, it does create personalities that become larger than life and that pop up in other places. The question I guess I would have for you only is, and I don't think it's an answerable one, would you lump in MMA to boxing? Would you just say combat sports or something? Because MMA has certainly replaced boxing as the version of a sport where two people beat the crap out of each other that matters to America. And the personalities from MMA are now roughly where the personalities from boxing were 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I think you have an argument if you lump in MMA, if you just say combat sports in terms of the effect on the culture, I think you can probably stake that claim.
Yeah, I don't think I necessarily would, but if we were talking about the like intersecting lines, it's funny to imagine in what year it would be that MMA would have generated cumulatively more great art than boxing. Maybe like 2,500. I don't know. That it has a long way to go. All right, my last pick, a sport that punches above its weight and does not typically involve punching, and one that I'm surprised that Mike has not mentioned is tennis.
I knew you were going to say tennis.
Yeah. I mean, it would probably be horse racing if we were going to be, but whatever. I don't want to talk about horse racing. Anyway, I have not read Infinite Jest. I know some people on this Zoom have read it, but I do think that it has some of the kind of psychological drama that boxing does as, one of the, I guess, two sports that we've talked about where it's a mano sort of situation. My colleague Seth Maxon, who edits sports stuff for Slate, we were talking about this, and he said his point about tennis was it's solitary and therefore more inherently character-driven and psychologically weighty than other sports and more physically and athletically demanding than golf or bowling. But I think it's kind of surprising given, again, the lack of prominence or popularity of the sport in America today beyond the Williams sisters, and we can mention King Richard here. It has still, I think, continued to generate kind of interesting cultural products. I was just watching the trailer for the new Luca Guadagnino movie Challengers, starring Zendaya. But like Royal Tenenbaums, Match Point, there's recently a Battle of the Sexes movie, and then you go back to like Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train, and then another colleague, Ben Richmond, pointed out Pong. I guess I don't know if you consider that tennis or table tennis, but also Mario Tennis. And then you got to throw in like Levels of the Game by John McPhee, and then also David Foster Wallace's like nonfiction about tennis. I think there is a bunch of fodder there and a bunch of different media.
Yeah, that's a good call. I think tennis, and this might go back to what we said about football, the players are individuals and they present as themselves and their personalities are very visible. Novak Djokovic and Roger Federer and Nadal and Serena Williams and Venus Williams, these people are immediately identifiable in a way that football players are not, because they're wearing helmets and visors and everything else. And they are singular warriors. I think Agassi's autobiography is the best sports autobiography I've ever read. And it's partly because you knew exactly how Andre Agassi presented himself. And then to get a version of his life that was so different from that was so fascinating. And to hear the behind the scenes stories of him with, like gluing hair on his head because his hair was such a important part of his image and all that sort of stuff. There are ways in which tennis can create personalities unlike any other sport. Golf could do it too, in theory, but golfers are kind of boring. And, after Tiger, there hasn't been a golfer that anyone really wanted to learn more about or care about. And so it has a lot of structural advantages in terms of the way that it can influence the culture, I think. And it'll be interesting to see what happens when Djokovic, Nadal is basically gone, Federer is gone, Djokovic is basically is at the tail end, even though he still wins every major he plays in. Serena is at the end. Venus has been gone for a few years. Who knows whether another generation of stars will emerge whose personalities end up mattering and who sort of generate, Serena Williams showed up in Beyonce's video when her album came out, and it was like, there she was. The most important album by the most important musician in the world features Serena Williams. Like, that's just, she was that person in that culture. And it'll be interesting to see if they are replaced by anyone. It's hard to imagine that another generation of tennis stars as important as those 5 people will come along, but maybe.
And I would also say, you got to mention Billie Jean King here. I made a brief reference to the Battle of the Sexes, but as far as women getting access to sports, I think you have to put tennis at the top of the list as the kind of explanation for that. And it continues to be the sport internationally that gives the most prominence and access to women and creates the most female stars. And so the Williams sisters, I think it's impossible to reproduce that phenomenon, but the sport will continue to draw the best women athletes in the world due to the, money-making opportunities that, you can point to Billie Jean King and Venus and Serena for, kind of being responsible for largely. And so I think as a kind of sign for the future, even though there are reasons to believe that tennis is, maybe flatlining in certain areas, that's a reason to maybe to be optimistic. But like also, Stefan, Netflix has this tennis show, Breakpoint, that's trying to kind of bring drama in the same way that Drive to Survive did in Formula One. I don't honestly have a sense of like how successful it has been or is going to be in terms of minting this new generation of personalities. I mean, I think it's trying with Nick Kyrgios and Francis Tiafoe and so forth, but it'll just be interesting to see what happens in the next, 5, 10, 20 years.
And I don't think that we are at the end of documentaries, retrospectives, interesting art being created based on this generation of tennis superstars. I think there'll be more Williams sisters content and more Big Three content. There's going to be great work out there to be done, and some of it will be fictionalized and piggyback off of their success, which draws the thing that we haven't talked about is the comparison between tennis and golf as sort of cultural forces. Golf's produced a ton of writing, and when George Plimpton said the thing about the small balls, he was referring in part to golf. A lot of lyrical, elegiac writing that the game is sort of conducive to. And yet, when you look at this, and I just may not be remembering everything, but the first things I think about when I think of golf movies are comedies. I mean, it's not about how wonderful and motivating and dramatic the sport is. It's like Caddyshack and Tin Cup and Happy Gilmore and stuff like that. And the literature of golf is huge and the library is extensive. But, it's not like Tiger Woods has produced the kind of canon of popular culture that Michael Jordan has. And I think that has something to do with the sport. And not to deny Tiger Woods' influence culturally. It's just to say that they are very different characters culturally.
And golf is just a conversation stopper, so maybe we should just end the show there. Although we will have a little bit more in our bonus segment momentarily. But Mike Schur, thank you very much. I am not entirely convinced with the baseball selection. Stefan, what do you think? What do you think of our final rankings? Anything that you would want to change?
No, I kind of, I think because of who we are and how old we are, I think I would have put baseball number 1 too, just based on the sheer volume of material and how much it's influenced us personally. So yeah, maybe not the most objective ranking, but I think it's a fair one for who we are.
Anything you would want to change, Mike?
No, I think you could make an argument that it's basketball, but I think still right now, in a legacy way, it's still baseball. So I'm happy. I'm content with my pick.
It would be more interesting if it was basketball, but ultimately, I don't know if I have it in me to strongly disagree, and that's why I'm not doing a more popular sports show, I guess. All right, that is our show for that is our show for today. Our producer is Kevin Bendis. To listen to past shows and subscribe or just reach out, go to slate.com/hangup, and you can email us at hangup@slate.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. For Stefan Fatsis and Mike Schur, I'm Josh Levine. Remember Zelmo Beatty, and thanks for listening.
I'm Jonathan Braylock.
I'm Dra Milligan.
And I'm James III. And we're the hosts of Black Men Can't Jump in Hollywood. It's a comedic podcast that reviews films with leading actors of color and analyzes them in the context of race and Hollywood's diversity issues.
Yeah. Listen to new episodes on Mondays. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
I don't care where you get them. I just want you to listen.
Don't threaten the people. We need them to listen.
Oh, okay. Sorry, guys. Listen to us.
Hey. Yeah, put on a happy voice.
What more can I say? You know what it is.
Black men can't jump.
There's a reckoning happening in women's soccer in the U.S.
Tonight, the world of professional women's soccer is turned upside down.
It began with a few brave players who decided to speak out. Their decision forever changed the game. This is their story.
This is about safety in our own lives and our bodies.
The whole system is screwed up.
From Religion of Sports and PRX, I'm Brianna Scurry, and this is Counterattack.
Women's sports are powerful. They deserve respect. They are the future.
Listen now on Amazon Music.